Anyone who appeals to Romans 4 as evidence of biological descent being the criteria for receiving the promise of Abraham couldn't have chosen a more ineffective passage. Romans 4:13 literally argues for faith, not biological descent. Romans 4:13 is one of the strongest texts supporting covenantal inclusion over bloodline-only IO, because Paul explicitly disconnects the inheritance from biological descent and grounds it in the covenantal category of faith. The verse states that the promise to Abraham and his seed came not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith, which means Paul is deliberately shifting the basis of heirship away from Torah, genealogy, circumcision, and fleshly descent. If Paul intended a strictly biological argument, he would have appealed to lineage or tribal purity. Instead, he uses Abraham before circumcision, when he was childless and physically incapable of producing heirs, to show that the promise does not depend on biological potency. This completely undercuts the bloodline-only framework. The law had condemned Israel, so biology could not be the mechanism by which God restores the whole covenant family. Faith becomes the way scattered Israelites, proselytes, the not my people of Hosea, and the remnant of Isaiah are all pulled back into the Abrahamic promise. Paul is not universalizing the promise to humanity, he is covenantalizing it within Israel's covenantal structure. Romans 4 sets up Romans 9-11, where Paul clarifies that not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, and that the children of the flesh are not necessarily the children of the promise. Together, these chapters show that the heirs are defined covenantally by faith, not by mere biology. This supports the covenantal inclusion model of IO. Perfectly, Israel remains the only people in view, but the mechanism of inclusion is covenantal fidelity, not genetic descent. The promise to Abraham was originally given entirely to his biological descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes, and every statement of the covenant in Genesis is grounded in physical lineage, land, and national identity. The biblical language is unmistakably genealogical. The seed comes from your own body and is carried throughout their generations. The promise was never addressed to humanity in general, nor was it framed in universalist terms. Paul fully acknowledges this starting point when he says in Romans 9:4-5 that the covenants and promises belong to Israel. However, Paul's redefinition of seed narrows and intensifies it by locating the entire covenant identity of Israel in the one representative Israelite, the Messiah. In Galatians 3:16, Paul's argument is not that seed means all, believers everywhere, but that Israel's covenant lineage is summed up in Christ as the corporate representative of Israel in the same way. Isaiah's servant is sometimes the nation and sometimes an individual. Thus, Paul is not dismantling Israel's lineage, he is redefining what counts as true Israel within the covenant. Those who were in Christ were Abraham's seed not because they were random Gentiles, but because they had been reattached to the covenantal root of Israel, diaspora Israelites, proselytes, and those within Israel's orbit who were being restored according to the prophetic pattern of Hosea, Isaiah, and Deuteronomy. Paul's not all Israel is Israel per Romans 9:6 does not open the covenant. To humanity, it restricts the promise to faithful Israel within the Messiah, which included those of Israel who were not biological descendants of Israel, like covenantally estranged Israelites or attached proselytes. Therefore, the promise remained entirely within the Israelite world, originally biological, and then, through Paul's reinterpretation, covenantally concentrated in the faithful remnant embodied in Christ. Paul never universalizes the promise beyond Israel, he simply redefined Israel internally through the Messiah rather than through mere genealogy. The law repeatedly stated that the Jew, proselyte, was to be treated as the native-born. Per Exodus 12:48-49, Leviticus 19:34, and Numbers 15:14-16, which means their covenantal status, Sabbath, sacrifices, festivals, purification, judicial standing, was fully equal to biological Israelites. In the Septuagint, the same Greek word is used for translating ger as in the New Testament for proselyte. They are one and the same. Land inheritance was never the boundary marker of covenant identity. The promises were transmitted through the covenant itself, not acreage distribution. That's exactly how they could be considered Israelites while being without land ownership. Land ownership is a category that didn't pertain to covenantal identity. The covenantal inclusion model correctly acknowledges that the Scriptures present more than one way to be identified as Israel. The Torah explicitly allows the Jew to be as the native-born per Exodus 12:48-49. Leviticus 19:34, which is a covenantal, not biological, category. Likewise, prophetic literature distinguishes between Israel after the flesh and Israel who returns to Yahweh per Isaiah 10:20-22 and Hosea 1-2, meaning identity can be covenantally restored, not just genetically inherited. Paul inherits this multi-layered framework, distinguishing between Israel after the flesh and the remnant according to Grace Romans 9:6-8 and 11:5, while assuming that Gentile inclusion refers to dispersed Israelites or covenantal adoptees, not random outsiders. Even within Israel's own tribes, many members lived outside their ancestral allotments, especially in the diaspora. So lack of land inheritance does not negate covenant membership any more than diaspora Israelites lacking land negated theirs. Therefore, Romans 4 cannot be used to argue that the promise belongs only to biological Israelites, because Paul's whole point in this chapter is to show that the inheritance never depended on physical descent or Torah, but on the covenantal promise given through Abraham's faith. If Paul intended a biology-only argument, he would not use Abraham's near death, infertility, or his pre-circumcision state as the basis of the analogy. Instead, he argues that those who share Abraham's covenantal faith, not merely his flesh, are the heirs. Romans 4 sets up Romans 9, where Paul explicitly rejects the idea that physical descent alone defines Israel. Therefore, Romans 4 actually contradicts a strict genealogical reading. It expands heirship within the Israelite covenant community. Diaspora Israelites, proselytes, the not my people, Hosea Israel, not through genetics, but through the covenantal mechanism of faith. To Paul, covenant defined the heirs, not biology.